My son slid a piece of paper across the dining room table on Christmas Eve, and for a moment, I just stared at it like it was something I'd never seen before, like I'd forgotten what paper was. It had numbers on it, a lot of numbers, and at the bottom, a line waiting for my signature. "Dad," he said, and his voice had that particular flatness I'd come to recognize over the past few years, the tone he used when he'd already decided how things were going to go. "We've talked about this. The house needs to go into both our names. It's just practical." His wife, my daughter-in-law, sat across from me with her hands folded in her lap and a small smile on her face, not a warm smile. The kind you see on someone who's already won an argument they haven't had yet. I looked over at my younger sister, Marlene, who'd driven up from Savannah for the holidays. She was the only other person at the table. She looked at the paper, then at me, and said nothing. But I saw her jaw tighten. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a finishing carpenter, the kind of work that leaves you with bad knees and rough hands and a very clear sense of what things are worth. I built custom cabinetry, crown molding, hardwood floors in houses I could never afford to own. And then 12 years ago, when my wife Susan passed, pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end, I sold our house in Columbus and bought a smaller place in Macon with the life insurance money and what was left of our savings. Paid cash. $420,000. A 3-bedroom house on a quiet street with a magnolia tree in the front yard that Susan would have loved. That house is mine. Free and clear. No mortgage, no lien, no partner. My son, his name is Joel, moved back in with me 2 years ago. He'd been living in Atlanta with his wife Renata, and for a while things had seemed fine. He was working in logistics management, decent salary. They had a nice apartment in Midtown. Then the company downsized. Joel lost his job in March of that year, and by June they were 3 months behind on their rent. He called me, and I told him what any father would tell his son. Come home. Get back on your feet. I didn't charge them rent. I didn't set a timeline. I stocked a refrigerator, and I gave them the 2 larger bedrooms, and I moved my own things into what used to be the guest room. That's what you do for family. At least that's what I thought. For the first few months it was all right. Joel was job hunting and Renata was picking up remote contract work, and we ate dinner together most nights, and sometimes it almost felt like having a full house again. I'd forgotten what that was like. But things shifted. Slowly at first, then all at once, the way bad things usually go. Joel stopped interviewing. He told me the market was rough, that logistics jobs were hard to come by, that he was being selective. Meanwhile, Renata started making comments, small ones, offhand, about the house. How the kitchen layout wasn't efficient, how the neighborhood was changing, how it made more sense financially to consolidate assets in a situation like ours. I didn't know what she meant by a situation like ours. We didn't have a situation. I had a house. They had a temporary arrangement. Then 6 months ago, Joel sat me down and proposed what he called a sensible restructuring. He wanted to be added to the deed. Just his name, not Renata's. He was clear about that, as if that made it better. His reasoning was that if something happened to me, he didn't want the house tied up in probate. He'd done research, he said. He had printouts. He used words like estate planning and co-tenancy and survivorship rights. I told him I already had a will. I told him the house was going to him and his sister. Joel has an older sister, Pamela, who lives in Portland with her family and who has never once asked me for anything. I told him the arrangements were already made and I appreciated his concern. He dropped it. Or I thought he did. What I didn't know, what I found out later, was that during those 6 months, Joel and Renata had not been paying back a debt they owed me. When they first moved to Atlanta 3 years earlier, I'd lent them $40,000 for a down payment on what they said was going to be a condo. They never bought the condo. I don't know exactly what they used the money for. They've been making small payments here and there, a few $100s every few months, and I told myself that was fine. That family doesn't keep a ledger, that Joel would sort it out when he was more stable. But the payments had stopped entirely 8 months ago. And when I gently mentioned it at Thanksgiving, Joel said, "Dad, we're living here. We're not charging you for our time. You're not charging us rent. It seems like it balances out." I remember setting down my fork very carefully when he said that. "That's not how a loan works," I said. He shrugged. "It's family." That was Thanksgiving. Christmas Eve was worse. The paper he slid across the table was a quitclaim deed. He'd had it drawn up by someone. I don't know if it was an actual attorney or just something he'd downloaded and filled in himself, but it had my name on it as the grantor and his name as the grantee, and it was asking me to transfer 50% ownership of my home to my son for the stated consideration of $1. $1. I read it twice. The magnolia tree outside the dining room window had dropped its leaves by then. It was just a gray shape in the December dark. "Joel," I said. "What is this?" "It's what I was telling you about. The estate planning." "This isn't estate planning. This isn't you asking me to give you half my house." Renata shifted in her seat. "We've put a lot into this household, Martin," she said. "My name is Martin." She'd started using it recently instead of Dad, or even just not addressing me directly, which is what she used to do. "We've contributed. We've been here. We've been helping. You've been living here rent-free for 2 years," I said. "That was the arrangement. The arrangement was that you'd get back on your feet." Joel leaned back in his chair. "Look, Dad, I'm not trying to make this adversarial. I'm trying to secure our future. You're 63. You've got some health things going on." He meant my blood pressure and the mild arthritis in both hands, which I'd mentioned once in passing, and apparently he'd filed away. It just makes sense to have things formalized now, while everyone's thinking clearly. I looked at my sister Marlene again. She was looking at her placemat. "What if I say no?" I asked. The silence lasted maybe 4 seconds. Then Joel said, "Then we'd have to rethink the arrangement." There it was. I pushed my chair back from the table and stood up. My knees ached the way they always do in cold weather. I picked up the quitclaim deed and I folded it in half and I set it down in the empty space in front of my plate. "Merry Christmas," I said, and I walked out of my own dining room, got my coat from the hook by the door, and went outside. It was 38 degrees and I hadn't planned on going anywhere. I just needed to not be in that room. I sat on the porch steps for a minute, looking at the street. A neighbor's house had those big colored lights strung along the roofline, red and green and blue, blinking in a slow pattern. Some kids down the block had built a lopsided snowman out of the thin layer of snow we'd gotten 2 days before. It had a carrot nose, and it was already leaning to one side. Marlene came out 10 minutes later and sat down next to me. "How long has this been building?" she asked. "A while," I said. She nodded. "She's 4 years younger than me, and she's always been the more practical one. After Susan died, she was the one who handled the paperwork, who sat with me through the worst of it, who drove me to appointments when I couldn't make myself get behind the wheel." She said, "You know what you have to do." "I know what you have to do." "I know. Do you need help?" "Not tonight," I said. "Tonight I just need to think." I called Pamela from the porch. It was late, she's 2 time zones behind in Portland, but she picked up on the second ring, and I could tell from her voice that she'd been awake. Maybe she'd sensed something. Fathers want to believe their children can sense things. I told her what had happened. I kept it brief. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Dad, I'm so sorry. Do you need me to come?" "No," I said. "Stay with your family. Enjoy Christmas. That's not—" "Pamela, I'm okay. I just wanted you to know." I went back inside at around 9 o'clock. Joel and Renata were in the living room. The TV was on, but no one was watching it. The quitclaim deed was still on the dining room table where I'd left it, still folded. I went to my room and I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark for a long time. Then I called a man I know, a real estate attorney named Cliff, who I'd met years ago through a contractor friend. I'd helped finish his study, the built-in bookshelves that went floor to ceiling on 2 walls, and we'd stayed loosely in touch. I knew he was good because I had heard about him from 3 different people over the years. I left him a voicemail. I knew he wouldn't hear it until after the holiday, but I needed to make the call. I needed to hear my own voice saying out loud that I was going to do something about this. I slept about 3 hours that night. Christmas morning was the strangest I'd had since the year Susan was sick, and we tried to pretend everything was normal for Joel and Pamela's sake. Joel and Renata came downstairs late and we were polite to each other, the way strangers are polite. Surface words, no eye contact, careful spacing in the kitchen. Marlene made coffee. Nobody mentioned the deed. I spent most of the day in my workshop in the garage, which is the only space in that house that still feels entirely mine. I was refinishing a small side table I'd picked up at an estate sale. Just something to do with my hands. The smell of the stripper and the wood and the mineral spirits is the same as it's always been. Some smells don't change no matter what else does. Cliff called me back on December 27th. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which is a quality I've come to deeply appreciate in people. When I was done, he asked a few questions. When I'd bought the house, whether there was any documentation of the loan I'd made to Joel, whether anything had been signed or was in writing. The loan was partially documented. When I'd written Joel the check for $40,000, I'd written personal loan in the memo line, and I'd followed it up with a text message, which I still had, saying, "This is a loan. Let me know when you want to talk about repayment terms." Joel had replied, "Thanks, Dad. Of course. We'll sort it out." That was 3 years ago. Cliff said the text exchange wasn't nothing. He said the memo line helped. He said the quitclaim situation was concerning, not because Joel had asked. People ask for all kinds of things, but because of what Joel had implied when I said no. The rethinking the arrangement comment. Cliff called that leverage. He said using implicit threats about housing stability to pressure someone into signing away property rights was something a court would take a dim view of. He asked me what I wanted. I said I wanted my house to stay my house. I said I wanted the loan repaid or formally acknowledged. And I said I wanted clarity about what comes next, because I couldn't keep living in a situation where the people under my roof thought they could threaten me into giving them what they wanted. He said he could help with all of that. He drafted a formal loan agreement retroactively, which is legally valid when both parties acknowledge the debt, and sent it to Joel by certified mail on January 3rd. He also sent a separate letter on his firm's letterhead, informing Joel and Renata that given recent conversations, Martin Calloway had engaged legal counsel to review the living arrangement and that any future discussions about the property should be directed to his office. I was sitting in my workshop when I heard Joel's voice change. He'd gotten the certified mail. I heard him come inside, heard him open the envelope in the kitchen, heard the particular sound a person makes when something they didn't expect has arrived. Not quite words, just a sound. He came to the garage. He stood in the doorway holding both letters. "You got a lawyer," he said. I did. "Dad, Joel." I kept my hands on the table I was working on. I didn't look up right away. "I have been patient with you for a long time. I have given you every reasonable thing I could give you. I lent you $40,000 that you stopped paying back. I let you live in my home for 2 years without asking for a dime, and on Christmas Eve, you sat down at my table and asked me to sign away half of what I own. And when I said no, you implied that things would get unpleasant." I looked up then. "I'm 63 years old. I have arthritis and high blood pressure, and I worked with my hands for 31 years to build what I have. I will not be leveraged." He started to say something. "I think it began with, 'I didn't mean,'" I said. "Read the letters." He went back inside. Renata tried once, 2 days later, when Joel was out of the house and she caught me at the kitchen table reading. She sat down across from me and used a softer voice than she usually did and said that she hoped I understood that Joel was just scared, that he worried about what would happen to them if my health declined, that it came from love. I looked at her for a moment. She is not an unintelligent person. That almost made it worse. "Renata," I said, "people who love you don't hand you documents on Christmas Eve. They talk to you. They sit down and they say, 'Dad, I'm scared, I'm struggling, I need help.' That's what love sounds like." What happened at that table was something else. She didn't have an answer for that. They started making plans to move out in January. Not warm plans. Not sit-down conversations about timelines and logistics, but I heard them on the phone in the evenings. Heard the particular murmur of people discussing where to go next. Renata's sister lived in Charlotte. There was talk of that. On January 19th, Joel came to me and signed the loan agreement. All of it, the original $40,000, with a repayment schedule that Cliff and I had agreed was reasonable given his circumstances. No interest, just the principal over 4 years in monthly payments that he could realistically make once he was employed again. He signed it without a fight. I think having it formalized actually relieved him in some way. Or maybe he just understood by then that I wasn't moving. They left on the first weekend of February. Joel hugged me at the door. A real hug, the kind that takes a second to end. I didn't ask what it meant. Sometimes you just accept the thing that's offered. I called Pamela that night and told her. She exhaled in a way that made me realize she'd been holding her breath for months. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. "Actually, yeah. The house was quiet in a way it hadn't been in 2 years. I made dinner for one and ate it at the kitchen table and watched the news. Marlene called around 8 o'clock just to check in. She does that. She said, "How does it feel?" I thought about it. Outside the window, the magnolia tree was bare, but it was still there. Same as it had always been. Like mine, I said. And it was. There's a version of that Christmas Eve where I signed the paper. I've thought about it. It would have been easier in the moment. Just pick up the pen. Avoid the silence, avoid Joel's flat stare, and Renata's careful smile, and the 4 seconds of quiet after I asked what would happen if I said no. I know that version exists. Because I've lived enough of my life being the person who smoothed things over to know exactly how it would have felt. Familiar. Temporary. And wrong. What I've come to understand is that the way things unfold is rarely accidental. Joel didn't arrive at that Christmas Eve table out of nowhere. He arrived there because every time I gave without boundaries, every time I treated generosity as a substitute for an honest conversation, every time I told myself, family doesn't keep a ledger, I was teaching him something, not intentionally, but consistently. The paper on the table was just the final lesson in a curriculum I'd helped build. That's the hardest part to sit with. Not what they did, what I allowed for years, without naming it. I think about the $40,000 loan I made with a memo line and a text message, and then never followed up on. I thought I was being gracious. What I was actually being was unclear. An unclear kindness has a way of becoming someone else's entitlement. You can't blame a person entirely for walking through a door you left open. But here's what I also know. Recognizing that I'd made it easier for things to go wrong is not the same as accepting that I deserved what happened at that table. Those are two different things. And I had to be smart enough to hold both of them at once, to say I could have handled some of this better. And what my son did on Christmas Eve was not okay, and I am allowed to respond to it with something other than forgiveness on demand. That distinction between self-awareness and self-surrender is the one I keep coming back to. Cliff asked me what I wanted. Not what was fair, not what would keep the peace. What did I want? And I had to be honest enough with myself to answer that question instead of deflecting it. I wanted my house. I wanted the loan acknowledged. I wanted to stop living in a situation where the people under my roof believed they could pressure me into compliance, naming those things out loud, clearly, to another person. That took something. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. The way certain kinds of hard things are necessary. The magnolia tree is still there. Joel made his first loan payment in March. We haven't talked much, but we've talked some. I don't know what the future looks like with him. I know what it looks like without the weight of that arrangement sitting on my chest every morning. Marlene called last week just to check in, the way she does. She asked how I was sleeping. Better, I said, and I meant it.